The afternoon sun was shining brightly over Oakwood Lane, a quiet suburban neighbourhood lined with manicured lawns. For Marcus Daniels, this was just another day on the job, delivering packages to people who barely acknowledged him beyond a brief nod or wave. He had only recently been assigned to this area, having taken over the route from a colleague. The streets, the houses, the people, it was all new to him. As he approached his next stop, the engine of his delivery van rumbled quietly in the background. He grabbed the package labelled 132 Oakwood Lane and headed toward the house, his eyes scanning the address to make sure he had it right. He moved quickly, wanting to finish his route before dark, but as he walked up the driveway, he felt the tickling sensation of being watched. A figure appeared from a house across the street, an older man, grey-haired and chubby, standing on his porch with arms crossed. His eyes were fixed on Marcus with an unwelcoming expression. Marcus knew that look. He'd seen it before, in different places, at different times. It was the look that people gave him when they felt he was somewhere he didn't belong. Marcus ignored his stare and continued with his task. He placed the package on the doorstep, took a quick photo to confirm the delivery, and started back toward his van. That's when he heard the voice. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The words were sharp, biting through the air like a knife. Marcus paused, turning slowly to face the man. He remained calm, though his instincts were already screaming at him to brace himself. "I'm making a delivery," Marcus said, keeping his voice even. "Just doing my job." The man stepped off his porch, his eyes focusing on Marcus's face as he approached him. "That's not your job," he snapped. "I've been watching you, and you don't belong here. What's in those packages? Huh? Stealing from people now?" Marcus blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the accusation. His mind tried to make sense of it. Stealing? The man couldn't be serious. "Sir, I'm not stealing anything," Marcus said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm the new delivery driver for this route, just dropping off packages." But the man wasn't listening. His eyes glanced between Marcus and the delivery van. "I don't believe you. You're probably scouting out houses to rob. You think I don't know what's going on? I'm calling the cops." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had been in this situation before. Too many times to count, in fact. He knew what was coming, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. No amount of reasoning would change this man's mind. "There's no need for that," Marcus tried again, though he could already hear the tension rising in his own voice. "Look, I have my ID and delivery paperwork." "I don't care what you have," the man interrupted, his face red with anger. "You don't belong in this neighbourhood. Who let you in here?" Marcus could feel the heat of frustration getting to him already. This was exactly the kind of situation that could quickly go out of control, and he knew that staying calm was his only defence. Still, a part of him wondered why he had to prove his innocence over and over again, simply because of the colour of his skin. He was just doing his job. Was that so hard to understand? Before he could respond, a voice from down the street called out, "George, stop! What are you doing?" A woman in her mid-30s with curly brown hair and a worried expression hurried across her yard toward them. She looked at Marcus and then back at the older man. "George, he's just the delivery guy," she said, her tone soft. "He's not doing anything wrong." George turned to her, his jaw set. "You don't know that, Sarah. I've seen people like him before. They act like they're delivering something, but they're casing houses. I'm not going to let this happen on my street." "People like him," Sarah repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "You're accusing him of stealing because he's black. That's insane. You need to stop this before you make things worse." Marcus stood silently, watching the exchange. He appreciated Sarah's intervention, but he knew how this would likely end. George wasn't going to back down, not until he got the police involved. As if on cue, George pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. The weight of years of similar encounters reminded him that no matter what he did, to some people, he would always be a suspect. "Yes, police?" I'm on Oakwood Lane, George said into the phone, his voice loud enough for Marcus and Sarah to hear. There's a man here, a black man, acting suspiciously. I think he's stealing packages from people's porches. You need to send someone right away. Sarah groaned in frustration, rubbing her forehead as if trying to soothe a headache. This is ridiculous, George. You're calling the cops on an innocent man. Just look at him. He's got a uniform and a delivery van. He's doing his job. But George ignored her, continuing to talk on the phone. Marcus stood there, resigned to his fate. He could leave and drive off before the police arrived, but he knew that wouldn't help. And within minutes, the sound of police sirens cut through the suburban stillness. The sound of police sirens grew louder as a patrol car turned the corner and rolled down Oakwood Lane. Marcus stood still, hands by his sides, his face a mask of calm, even though his chest rose with the familiar anxiety creeping in. He had done everything right, kept his cool, explained himself. But here he was again, caught in a situation he had absolutely no reason to be in, and all because George couldn't see past the colour of his skin. The patrol car stopped, and two officers stepped out. One of them, Officer Johnson, a tall, broad-shouldered man, approached first. His partner stayed back, surveying the scene, hand resting near the radio clipped to his vest. "Is there a problem here?" Officer Johnson asked, looking between Marcus, George, and Sarah, who was standing off to the side, her arms crossed in frustration. Before Marcus could speak, George jumped in. "I called you. This man," he jabbed a finger in Marcus's direction, "has been acting suspiciously. I've been watching him. He's taking packages from people's porches and pretending to be a delivery guy." The officer turned to Marcus, his face unreadable. "Sir, can I see some identification?" Marcus, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, along with his work ID and the delivery paperwork for the route. "I'm Marcus Daniels. I work for Speedy Delivery Service. This is my route today." Officer Johnson nodded, taking the IDs and paperwork without a word. He glanced at them briefly before walking over to his partner, who ran the information through their system. Marcus noticed the police officers were more relaxed than when they first arrived. This wasn't the first time they'd seen something like this. It was common for delivery drivers, especially black ones, to be accused of suspicious behaviour in specific neighbourhoods. The officers weren't surprised, but Marcus knew the outcome could still go either way. Sarah, who had been watching the whole exchange, stepped forward. "Officers, this is ridiculous. I live here, and I can tell you, Marcus is just doing his job. George here called you because he's..." She hesitated, casting a sidelong glance at George, then lowering her voice. "He's making assumptions based on nothing." George shot her a glare, but Officer Johnson held up his hand. "Ma'am, let's keep things calm here." The officer turned back to George, his expression neutral but authoritative. "Sir, we're going to verify everything. Let's wait until we have all the facts." George crossed his arms, but the look on his face told Marcus everything he needed to know. Facts wouldn't change George's mind. He had already decided who Marcus was long before the police arrived. To him, Marcus was a threat, not because of anything he had done, but simply because he existed in a space where George didn't think he belonged. The second officer, who had been typing into his handheld computer, gave a slight nod to Officer Johnson. "Everything checks out," he said quietly. "He's legit." Officer Johnson walked back over to Marcus, handing him his ID and paperwork. "All right, Mr. Daniels, everything's in order. You're good to go." Marcus nodded, taking his things back and sliding them into his pocket. He wanted to feel relieved, but all he felt was disappointment. "Are you kidding me?" George's voice cut through the silence. "He's not just delivering packages. He's up to something. I know it. Look at him. People like him don't just walk around here for no reason. People like him." Officer Johnson's voice took on a harder edge, his brow furrowing. "Sir, I suggest you stop right there." But George wasn't listening. His anger was spilling over now, uncontainable. I've lived in this neighbourhood for 30 years, and I'm not about to let people like him come in and do whatever they want." The officers exchanged a look, and Sarah, standing nearby, shook her head in disgust. She stepped closer to Marcus, her voice low and apologetic. "I'm so sorry you have to deal with this. This is beyond wrong." Marcus offered a tight smile, but he didn't say anything. He'd heard these apologies before. They were always well-meaning, but they never really changed anything. The damage was already done, and people like George didn't just change because someone told them they were wrong. "Sir," Officer Johnson said firmly, turning back to George, "I suggest you go back to your house and let this man do his job. There's no crime here, and if you continue, you could be looking at a charge for filing a false report." George's face flushed red, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, Marcus thought he might actually lunge forward, but instead, George took a step back. "This isn't over," he muttered, backing toward his house. "I'm telling you, something's wrong here. You'll see." Officer Johnson nodded. "Sorry about that, Mr. Daniels. You know how it is sometimes." Marcus forced a smile. "Yeah, I know how it is." The officer seemed to understand how Marcus felt, but there wasn't much else to say. He turned and walked back to his patrol car, his partner following. Within moments, the sirens faded into the distance, leaving the street quiet again. Sarah lingered for a moment. "Marcus, It's fine," Marcus said quickly, cutting her off before she could apologize again. "It's not your fault." "But it's not right," she insisted. "This shouldn't be happening." Marcus shrugged, though his frustration was evident. "It happens." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Sarah finally nodded, giving him a small, sad smile. Marcus appreciated her words, but it was time to continue his day. He had to get back to work. There were still deliveries to make, and despite everything, the job had to be done. With a final nod to Sarah, Marcus climbed into his van and started the engine. As he pulled away from the curb, he glanced in his rearview mirror. George's house stood still, the curtains in one of the windows twitching, as if someone were watching from behind. As Marcus drove away from Oakwood Lane, the hum of the van's engine filling the silence, his mind replayed the scene over and over again. The radio in the van crackled softly, but Marcus wasn't listening. It wasn't just George's words that hurt. It was the way the entire situation had unfolded so predictably. He had known from the moment George stepped onto his porch what was coming. And yet, even with that knowledge, it still didn't make it any less frustrating. Marcus knew he'd handled it well. He always did. But handling it didn't make it easier. Every time something like this happened, it chipped away at his peace, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable, even when he had done nothing wrong. The van rolled to a stop at a red light, and Marcus stared blankly out the window, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The light changed, and he drove on, his mind drifting to the past. Other times, when his presence had been questioned, and when his intentions were met with suspicion simply because of the way he looked. After dropping off a few more packages, Marcus was almost done for the day, and soon he could head home, where he could at least breathe freely for a while. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Glancing over, he saw a message from his wife, Lisa. "Hey babe, how's your day going?" Marcus smiled faintly, grateful for the brief distraction her message brought. He hadn't told her what happened yet, and he wasn't sure if he would. She worried too much as it was. Telling her would only make her upset, and Marcus didn't want that. He pulled into the final stop of the day, a small house tucked away at the edge of the neighborhood. After placing the last package on the doorstep, he paused, taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly. It had been a long day, but it was over now. As Marcus climbed back into the van, preparing to head home, he thought about George again. The man's rage felt personal, as if Marcus's mere existence in his neighborhood was an insult. He wondered what it was like to live with that kind of fear, the kind that made you see enemies where there were none. But then again, he didn't have to wonder. Marcus had spent his whole life being viewed as a potential threat by people like George. And while it never got easier, he had learned to rise above it. He had to, for himself, for his family. He couldn't let it break him. As he drove back toward the city, leaving Oakwood Lane behind, Marcus thought about the subtle ways racism seeped into everyday life. It wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it was quiet. A look, a pause too long, a question that wouldn't have been asked of someone else. What had happened today was an exhausting reminder that he would never be welcome in certain places. Marcus's phone buzzed, and this time it was a call. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number as his supervisor's. "Hey, Marcus." His supervisor's voice crackled through the speaker. "Is everything okay?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. He'd gotten through the day, after all. He'd done what he needed to do. "Yeah, everything's fine," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Just a misunderstanding with a customer. It's sorted now." The call ended, and Marcus sighed. The evening settled in over Oakwood Lane. George sat inside his house in frustration, pacing the living room with angry, deliberate steps. He couldn't shake the anger and disbelief that the police had sided with Marcus. How could they have missed it? His neighbours, people he had known for decades, had turned on him, defending the stranger. Even Sarah, who had always been so polite, had practically accused him of being racist. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, rustling the trees and sweeping leaves down the street. It was the kind of night that would have lulled George into a sense of calm. Suddenly, there was a spark, and the lights in his living room dimmed and then went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. George stopped in his tracks, blinking as his eyes adjusted. The hum of the refrigerator stopped, and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall ceased. Silence. Even the wind outside seemed to be holding its breath. "Damn it," George muttered under his breath. He groaned, heading for the window to see if the neighbours had lost power as well. But as he peered through the curtains, he noticed something strange. While his house was plunged into darkness, the rest of Oakwood Lane seemed to be perfectly fine. Porch lights glowed softly, and the faint blue light of televisions flickered from windows. The street was quiet and calm. "What the hell?" George muttered, his frustration growing. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stomped outside, determined to figure out what was going on. Maybe it was the breaker. But as he stepped into the cool evening air, a strange feeling washed over him. A heaviness, as if the air itself had thickened around him. His breath felt tight in his chest, and for a moment he hesitated, glancing nervously at the trees swaying gently in the wind. The street was empty, and his house stood out like a black hole among the neatly lit homes around it. George shook his head, cursing under his breath. "I'm not going to let this get to me." He made his way around the side of the house, shining the flashlight over the fuse box. As he reached out to flip the breaker, a sudden, sharp gust of wind swept through the yard, chilling him to the bone. George froze, his hand hovering over the switch. There was a crackling sound, like static electricity in the air, and for a split second he swore he felt something brush past him, cold and invisible, like a shadow moving just out of sight. George spun around, heart hammering in his chest. But there was nothing, just the empty yard, the wind rustling the leaves. "Get a hold of yourself, man," George muttered, forcing his hand back to the switch. He flipped it, but nothing happened. The house remained dark. His frustration boiled over into anger. He slammed the panel shut, muttering under his breath. First that damn delivery guy, now this. He turned to head back inside, but as he did, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Across the street, standing at the edge of the neighbour's yard, was a figure. It was too far away to make out clearly, but there was no mistaking the silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, and watching him. George's heart skipped a beat. He squinted into the darkness, shining the flashlight toward the figure, but the light seemed to bend away, swallowed by the shadows before it could touch the stranger. "Hey!" George called out, his voice shaky despite his best efforts. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. The person just stood there, silent and unmoving, like a statue. George's pulse quickened, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "I said, who's there?" he shouted, taking a step forward, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Still no response. But then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised an arm and pointed directly at George. A chill ran down his spine, and suddenly George felt an overwhelming sense of fear. George stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet as he turned and bolted toward the front door. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The house was still dark, and the silence was now oppressive. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, desperate to call someone, anyone. The figure's image stayed in his mind, the way it had stood there, watching him, judging him. George felt his stomach twist with a sickening realization that he couldn't shake. Maybe this was the universe's way of punishing him. Was this retribution for his hatred and blind prejudice? For hours, George sat in his dark living room. Every slight sound outside made him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the figure was still out there, waiting. And as the night wore on, George realized that he wasn't just afraid of the dark. He was afraid of what the dark had revealed about him. The sun rose slowly the following day, casting a pale light over Oakwood Lane. George's house was the only one on the block still without power. As he stood there, exhausted and defeated, a few neighbours glanced his way but quickly looked away. They had heard about the scene from the day before, and George could feel the unspoken judgment. For the first time in his life, George felt the sting of being judged for who he was, not by his actions but by something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the power outage, or the figure in the night, or even the way the neighbours now looked at him. It was the sense that he had been seen, truly seen, for what he was. And for the first time, George wondered if it was time to change. The late evening sun cast a dull orange glow over the city streets as Officer Mike Turner adjusted his grip on the steering wheel of his squad car. It had been a long shift, the kind that wore down a man's patience. His partner, Officer Bob Sanders, sat beside him, sipping on coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The police radio crackled to life, a static-filled voice cutting through the otherwise quiet drive. Unit 3, we have a 1068, possible burglary in progress. Suspect description, black male, mid-40s, wearing a dark hoodie, last seen near Jefferson and Oak. Mike's jaw tightened. It always seemed to be Jefferson and Oak, he said, glancing at Bob, who gave a slight shrug. Typical, Bob muttered. Let's see what we got. They turned the cruiser onto Jefferson Avenue, the low hum of the engine filling the air as the streetlights flickered overhead. Mike scanned the sidewalks, his mind already filling in the blanks. He didn't even need to think about it. He had seen enough of these calls to know how they'd end. There! Bob pointed toward a man exiting a convenience store, a plastic bag in one hand and a dark hoodie drawn over his head. Mid-40s, black. The match was too close to ignore. Mike pulled the car over and parked with a quick swerve. Adrenaline pumped through his veins as they both stepped out, hands already resting on their service belts. Hey! Mike called out, his voice sharp and commanding. The man, Charles Grant, turned slowly, his eyes flicking between the two officers. He didn't run or seem surprised by the confrontation. He simply stood there, his face calm and almost expectant, as if he had been in this situation 100 times before. Put the bag down. Hands where I can see them, Mike barked, moving closer. Bob flanked him on the other side, mimicking his movements. The man complied, placing the bag carefully on the ground before raising his hands in the air, fingers splayed out in a gesture of surrender. Look, officers, the man began, his voice even. I don't know what this is about, but... Turn around, hands behind your back, Mike interrupted, not interested in explanations. You match the description of a suspect in a robbery. We're taking you in. But I just came from the store, the man protested, though his tone remained measured, almost too calm for someone being arrested. I have the receipt. Turn around, Mike repeated, stepping forward and reaching for the cuffs. Deep down, a part of him knew this felt off. The man wasn't resisting, wasn't panicked, but Mike was already in motion, his mind made up before the man even opened his mouth. Charles Grant sighed softly and complied. Turning so that Mike could cuff him, Bob patted him down roughly, tossing a few suspicious glances at the convenience store, where a couple of onlookers had started to gather. Some already had their phones out. "This is a mistake," the man muttered under his breath as the cuffs clicked into place. "You're going to regret this," Mike snorted, ignoring the comment. They'd heard that line 1,000 times before. They led him to the back of the squad car, Bob pushing him in with little care. Mike slammed the door shut and climbed back into the driver's seat. The man had been calm, too calm. It didn't sit right. But Mike squashed the feeling, tightening his grip on the wheel as they pulled away from the curb. "That was too easy," Bob chuckled from the passenger seat. "Guess he knows the drill." Mike grunted in agreement, though his mind was elsewhere. They drove in silence toward the station, the streetlights blurring past them. Something about this felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Yet whatever it was, it wouldn't matter soon. He had done his job. The rest was out of his hands now. The drive to the station was short, but it felt like an eternity to Mike. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Bob, however, was in a good mood. "What do you think? Repeat offender? Looks like he's done this dance before," Bob chuckled, glancing back at Charles through the wire mesh, separating the front seats from the back. Charles didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the windshield. Mike caught the glance in the rearview mirror, and for a split second their eyes met. There was something there, an intensity that Mike couldn't place. A chill crept up his spine, but he pushed it down, pulling into the station's parking lot. As they stepped out of the car and opened the back door to escort Charles into the station, Mike noticed how calm the man remained. Most suspects would be squirming by now, cursing the officers under their breath, or making wild excuses. But this guy was different. He seemed very calm and collected, almost as if he was exactly where he wanted to be. He moved with a quiet assurance that only added to Mike's growing unease. Inside the station, the usual hum of activity greeted them. Phones rang, officers chatted, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Mike and Bob led Charles toward the booking desk, exchanging a few nods with colleagues along the way. But as they reached the holding area, everything changed. The desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork and did a double take when he saw who was standing in cuffs. His eyes widened, and for a second, Mike thought he might have been imagining things. "What the hell?" the sergeant muttered under his breath, pushing back his chair as he stood up. His expression shifted from confusion to something close to panic. "What's going on here?" "We brought him in," Mike said, his voice steady but uncertain. "Matches the description of a suspect in a robbery near Jefferson and Oak." "Matches the description?" The sergeant's eyes flicked to Charles, who remained silent, and then back to Mike. "Do you even know who this is?" Before Mike could answer, Charles finally spoke. His voice was low but commanding, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Charles Grant, your new police chief." The words hung in the air, freezing Mike in place. For a moment, everything in the station seemed to stop. Bob, who had been busy with paperwork, turned slowly, his face draining of colour. "No way," Bob muttered, his eyes darting from Charles to Mike. But there was no denying it. The desk sergeant was already reaching for his phone, and within seconds, a small crowd of officers began to gather. The news spread like wildfire through the station. The new chief had been arrested by his own officers. Mike's heart pounded in his chest, the realization crashing down on him like a wave. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of misunderstanding. But Charles Grant stood there, hands cuffed behind his back, and there was nothing funny about the look on his face. "Uncuff him," the sergeant ordered, his voice shaky. Mike fumbled with the key, his fingers trembling as he unlocked the cuffs. He could feel the eyes of every officer in the room on him. The sound of the cuffs falling to the floor echoed loudly, and when Charles rubbed his wrists and straightened his jacket, He looked at Mike with eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Officers," Charles said, his tone professional yet edged with steel. "I think we have a lot to discuss." Mike swallowed hard, unable to speak. Bob stood frozen next to him, as pale as a sheet. The crowd of officers dispersed quickly as the sergeant showed Charles to his new private office. The door closed behind them, leaving Mike and Bob standing awkwardly by the booking desk. What the hell just happened?" Bob whispered, his voice barely audible. Mike didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was spinning, his body stiff with embarrassment, fear and guilt. He had just arrested his new boss based on nothing but a vague description and a gut feeling. And now, his career, his entire reputation, was hanging by a thread. Minutes passed like hours as the station buzzed with whispers and side glances. Mike could feel the judgment in every gaze, though no one dared say anything to his face. Bob muttered something about going for a smoke and slipped out of the station, leaving Mike standing alone in the chaos. Finally, the office door creaked open and Charles stepped out, his face calm as if nothing had happened. The sergeant followed, his expression grave. Charles glanced around the station, his eyes briefly resting on each officer before landing squarely on Mike. "Officer Turner," Charles said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "A word, please." Mike's stomach dropped. He could barely manage a nod as he followed the new chief into the office, closing the door behind him. The office door clicked shut behind Mike, the sound echoing in his ears. He stood frozen just inside the room, trying to steady his breath. Chief Grant sat behind the desk, his posture calm, but there was no mistaking the intensity in his eyes. The room felt small and suffocating, the walls pressing in on him. Mike remained standing, feeling like a child caught in the act of some unforgivable mistake. Chief Grant folded his hands on the desk and looked directly at Mike. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Mike shifted uncomfortably under the silence, his mind racing with 1,000 explanations, excuses and apologies, none of which seemed reasonable enough to him. Finally, Charles spoke. "I'd like to know," he began, his voice slow and deliberate. "What exactly made you decide to arrest me tonight?" "Sit down," Grant said, motioning to the chair across from him. It wasn't a request. Mike obeyed, sitting stiffly, his pulse hammered in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. All the bravado and confidence he carried as an officer seemed to crumble under the weight of this man's steady gaze. Mike swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, and words failed to form. He'd been in plenty of tense situations, but none like this. How could he explain the reasoning behind an arrest based solely on race? He wanted to defend himself, to say it wasn't personal, but that would only make him sound more racist than he already seemed. "You fit the description," Mike finally muttered, his voice hoarse. It felt pathetic coming out of his mouth, but it was all he had. Grant raised an eyebrow. "A black man in a hoodie leaving a convenience store. That was enough for you." Mike blinked, not sure what to say. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing that anything he said would only escalate the situation further. The silence between them grew thick, almost suffocating. "I've read the reports about this department," Grant continued, his tone even but firm, "and I'm not blind to the culture here, but I want to make something clear. Things are going to change." Mike felt the sting of the words. The culture. He knew precisely what Grant meant, even if no one had ever said it aloud. There was an unspoken understanding between certain officers, guys like Bob, about who they could treat with suspicion and who got a pass. But Mike had always told himself he wasn't part of that. He wasn't racist, he was just doing his job. "Turner," Grant said, snapping Mike out of his thoughts. "I'm not here to fire you, not yet, at least. But you need to think long and hard about how you're approaching your role as a police officer. Because I'll tell you right now, if you can't adjust to the changes that are coming, you won't last a second under my watch." Mike shifted uncomfortably. "I was just doing my job." "That's the problem," Grant cut in. "You think it's enough just to do your job the way it's always been done. But if you're not questioning how and why you do things, you're part of the problem. Mike clenched his fists under the table, a mix of shame and anger bubbling up, but he bit his tongue. He wanted to argue, to say he wasn't like the others, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He'd acted on impulse, just like Bob would have. No questions, no second thoughts. Grant leaned back, watching him carefully. Look, I'm giving you a chance here. I'm not interested in ruining careers, but I'm interested in fixing this department. You've got potential, Mike. You can either get on board with where we're going, or you can keep doing what you've always done. But don't expect to survive in your position if you can't change. The weight of the chief's words made Mike feel like he'd been laid bare in front of a man who saw every flaw, every prejudice, every misstep. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about everything leading up to it, the assumptions he'd made, the unspoken rules he'd followed for years. I get it, Mike finally said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure he understood completely, but he knew he couldn't keep defending himself. Grant's expression softened just a little. I hope you do, because this department's changing, Turner, and I need people who are willing to look in the mirror and ask themselves hard questions. Mike nodded stiffly, standing up. The conversation was over, but he still felt guilty as he left Chief Grant's office. As he walked out of the office, his mind raced. The station was still buzzing with whispers, officers stealing glances at him as he passed. Mike walked out of Chief Grant's office, his legs feeling like lead. The buzz of the station seemed distant now, muffled by the storm in his head. The truth of what had just happened was sinking in. He had been so close to throwing his career away, but it wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about who he was, who he'd become without even realizing it. The words, "If you can't change," echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. Change. What did that even mean for a guy like him? He'd been on the force for years, following the rules, doing his job. But now, he couldn't help but question everything. Outside in the parking lot, Bob was leaning against the cruiser, cigarette in hand, a smug grin on his face. What'd the new boss say? Bet he gave you a good lecture, huh? Mike's hands balled into fists, but he forced himself to breathe. He stared at Bob, realizing for the first time how much he'd let himself be influenced by him. The way they joked about certain neighborhoods, the way they'd approached every call involving black men with more suspicion than anyone else. It was all clear now. This was part of the problem. It wasn't just a lecture, Mike said quietly, walking past Bob toward his car. Bob laughed, flicking his cigarette to the ground. Come on, man, you don't really buy all that crap, do you? That guy's just another suit coming in here, trying to change how we do things. He doesn't know what it's like out there. Mike paused, turning to face him. For years, he'd been comfortable going along with Bob, thinking they were doing their job. But the more he thought about Grant's words, the more he realized they had both missed the point. It wasn't just about the job. It was about how they did it and why. Maybe he does know, Mike said, his voice stronger now. Maybe we've just been too blind to see it. Bob's smirk faded, replaced by a look of confusion. What the hell are you talking about, Turner? Mike shook his head, not bothering to explain further. He had made his decision. If Bob wanted to stay stuck in the past, that was his choice. But as Mike got in the car, he promised himself to stop letting others dictate what kind of officer he was going to be. The city streets stretched out before him, and for the first time in years, Mike felt the weight of his badge like a burden instead of a shield. It had been a symbol of authority, but now it represented responsibility. A responsibility he hadn't taken seriously enough until now. As he drove through the streets of Jefferson and Oak, the familiar sights of the neighborhood came into view. The corner store where he'd arrested Grant earlier that night stood silently under the glow of a flickering streetlight. He slowed down as he passed it, remembering the look on Grant's face. The calm, collected way he'd handled the whole situation. Mike wondered if he could have done the same in Grant's position. Could he have stayed calm, treated with suspicion simply because of the color of his skin? A small group of teenagers loitered near the store, talking and laughing. Mike recognized one of them, Malik, a kid he and Bob had roughed up just last month for no real reason. He remembered the fear in Malik's eyes, the anger, the fear. Back then, Mike hadn't thought twice about it. He'd seen it as part of the job. But now, everything was different. Mike pulled over, rolling down his window. Malik turned, his expression suspicious as he recognized the police car. The other teens went quiet, watching. "Hey!" Mike called out, his voice steady but soft. "Malik, right?" Malik frowned, stepping closer. "Yeah. What do you want?" Mike took a deep breath. This was it. His chance to do something different, something better. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong last time. The way we treated you last wasn't right." The group of teens exchanged surprised glances, and Malik stared at Mike like he'd just spoken another language. "Are you serious?" "Yeah," Mike said, nodding. "I am. Look, things are changing at the department. They're changing for me too. I'm part of a new program, one where we're going to be working more with kids like you. You deserve to be treated with respect, and I didn't give you that. I'd like to fix it, if you'll let me." Malik didn't say anything for a long moment, but Mike could see the confusion softening in his eyes, the suspicion starting to fade. Finally, Malik nodded slowly. "All right, we'll see." Mike smiled faintly, giving a nod before pulling away from the curb. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, Mike felt like he was on the right path.